It's a pleasure to welcome you all to this East Nordic Chapter webinar. I'm glad to see that so many are attending, and I think this shows us that questions around language engage many of us working in the publishing industry, which I really think it should, because as editors of various kinds and as workers in the publishing industry, language is the water we swim in. But as editors working in countries where English is a second language, we swim in two different waters, the gigantic ocean of English and the much smaller freshwater lakes of the local languages. So how do these two relate? How do they influence each other? Are they opposites or do they reinforce? What are the tensions? What are the dynamics? Questions like these led us in the Nordic Chapter of East to look for expertise in these matters, and expertise we found indeed, because I had the pleasure of listening to Elizabeth Peterson at the Nordic Editors and Translators Conference in Turku, Åbo, a few months ago, and she had some answers, but more important, she had even more questions and more food for thought in these matters. Elizabeth Peterson is a sociolinguist and docent in the Department of Languages at the University of Helsinki and an associate professor at the University of Jyväskylä. She's an expert in language attitudes, sociolinguistics, and world Englishes. She has written and edited several books, among these the very interesting book English and the Nordic Countries, and she is the speaker of today's webinar. Elizabeth, we are very proud to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Are, and it's lovely to see you again. And thank you also for, I really appreciated the comments that you made in your introduction. Okay, so it's wonderful to see such a diverse crowd. And just so you know, I will definitely be coming from a linguist's perspective and also from a very Nordic perspective, because that was what I was asked to do. So I hope at this point that you can see my screen and also that you can hear me. Are we okay? I see Inez nodding. Thank you very much for the thumbs up. And look at all these logos. As Are mentioned, I recently had a change of employer, so I'm now at the University of Jyväskylä. So my project is in two different places, and my research project is called Language Awareness and Ideologies in Finland. You see our logo there at the bottom. And we pronounce that the Life Project, which I think is a very nice thing to call it, because language and life are very intricately interlinked. So a bit about me. Are already mentioned that we first met at, whoops, my screen is not, there we are, that we first met in Turku, Finland last August, when I gave a talk called English in the Nordic Countries, Links to Identity and Exceptionalism. And I'll be talking about similar themes today for you folks, especially this theme of exceptionalism with regard to the Nordic countries is something that I find very fascinating. And I'll be very interested to hear your thoughts about this in the question and answer period. In turn, that talk that I gave in Turku last August was based on the book that you see here in the picture on the left, and Are has also mentioned this, English in the Nordic Countries, Connections, Tensions, and Everyday Realities, which came out last year. So again, I'm a linguist, so I speak from that kind of a perspective, and I speak also from a Nordic perspective today. So as Are mentioned, I appreciate that you were paying such close attention to my talk. I do like to ask these questions. And the questions that I have guiding the talk today are these. How did we get to this point? And by we here, I refer to we meaning the people in the Nordic countries. How did we get to this point with the use of English? Second question guiding the talk today, what does exceptionalism mean in the Nordic context, especially regarding the use of English? Third, who owns our English? Again, meaning in the Nordic countries. And then finally, who exactly are we publishing for when we publish in English? As mentioned in the announcement for this talk, I'm also very interested in new forms of nationalism and how these points relate to the topic of nationalism. But for now, I purposefully leave that implicit rather than explicit so that we can open up this theme in the question and answer period. So now I'll proceed with point number 1. How did we get here? The spread of English. And I have put, you see these quotation marks or scare quotes, you might call them, around the spread, because one thing that happens in the literature about how English became a global language is as if it was a passive action, like you would spread butter on bread, forgetting that in fact it was done very, very deliberately, and we'll talk more about that later. So I would call this a misconception of sorts, then, this spread of English, as people say. So today, here is familiar territory for people who work in your professional field, academia and publishing. This is all very familiar. In your regions as well, I'm sure, that there has been a concerted effort in the past few decades in Nordic universities to enhance their global visibility and competitiveness through the use of English as a language of science and higher education. And this has grown, you can see the trend line goes just like this, for example, after Brexit, because we can see a shift in the center of gravity in universities and the science that we do in universities to incorporate English speakers. So more and more people are coming to the Nordic countries than ever before in the past 10 years or so. And at the same time, of course, we have this backdrop. I think this is common knowledge at this point, that the Nordic countries routinely rank among the most widely proficient speakers of English in the world, right up there with the Netherlands, with parts of Belgium, just a few percentage points off from places like the UK and Ireland in the US. But of course, what's so fascinating about the Nordic country setting is that English is an additional language here, no official status, so people have a different mother tongue, and at the same time, they just happen to be really, really good at English and have been for 3 or 4 generations already, and getting more proficient all the time. So here's the backdrop. And then we have some tensions when it comes to the responsibilities of universities as purveyors and owners of science and learning within these settings. It's important to remember that Nordic languages, I really liked Are's comparison to a small, calm lake with the Nordic languages compared to the sea of English. The Nordic languages only have up to a few million speakers per language. Swedish is the biggest. And among these nation states, among these speakers of Nordic languages, there's a real threat these days that their languages are no longer sustainable, especially in the domain of education and science, higher education in particular. This varies a lot from nation to nation. It's interesting to compare, and it seems to sort of recycle this kind of threat of English discourse. But right now there's a lot of talk about the domain, especially of higher education and science in all of the Nordic countries, and how do we keep the language of science alive in our national languages. So the figures right now across the Nordic countries are that something like 70 to 90% of academic and articles and dissertations are written in English rather than the national languages. A lot depends on the field of study. So there is this real fear of loss, that we will no longer be able to discuss science in our national languages because English will take over. And at the same time, we have this real tension because, of course, here, sorry, I should have written that out, Nordic Higher Institutes of Higher Education, that's what that HEI stands for. So universities and higher education is state-funded. So therefore, there's actually a responsibility to be the torchbearers, to maintain the native languages, the native cultures, to maintain science in these languages. So are these universities almost set up for an impossible task? How can they do both at the same time? There's a huge tension lying in there and a whole lot of research on the area, as you can see at the bottom of the slide there. When it comes to the spread of English and how we got here, I think everybody knows the story more or less because, well, it has to do with who's in power, economic, political, and otherwise. So one perspective, we'll see another perspective a bit later in my talk. The numerous sources describe the accelerated induction of English to the Nordic countries and indeed throughout the world subsequent to World War II, when the United States emerged as a global superpower. But in the Nordic countries, I could see the folks who were coming in, so this is a different point from many of you. English has come to the Nordic countries as a result of what we call soft or cultural imperialism, meaning that the Nordic countries have not been colonies, for example. They have not been colonized by English speakers, which is a very important point to remember here. So the Nordic countries have chosen to take on English. It's not a remnant of some kind of colonization or settlement. So in this way, the Nordic countries, including in their own discourse and ideologies, often position themselves as active agents. They came after English. They wanted English to come in. I've heard it said, for example, that the Nordic countries welcomed English in with open arms because these are small countries, and they knew at the time that if they wanted, I use the metaphor, they wanted a seat at the global table. And one way to do that was through very good use of English. And indeed, this has been a success story. The rise of English in the Nordic countries happened to coincide with something else that the Nordic countries are famous for. And here, no, I'm not talking about ABBA. Here's the band ABBA on the side of your screen. I mean, we can't talk about the 1970s in Sweden without talking about ABBA, right? But the point that I want to make here is that we had these concurrent trends, the growth of English and also this iconic social welfare, which especially is associated with Sweden in the 1970s, and then spreading to all of the Nordic countries, and indeed still today, that we're known for having this social welfare model. So point number 2 here, at the same time that these countries are concurrently gaining proficiency in English, and English is becoming more important both for internal purposes and for externally oriented purposes. And I'll open that internal and external up in a moment. But what I want to point out here is that these societies, part of what makes them work and part of the dogma, the ideology here, these are known as open societies. So open to technology, open to digitalization, open for internationalism, and so on. When it comes to the ideologies of the Nordic countries and the social welfare model, I would like to point out that there's one problem when it comes to the use of English and the conflict in backgrounds here. And that is namely that while English is desired commodity, indeed throughout the world, not just in the Nordic countries, linked to social connections, modernization, success, money, upward mobility, education, etc., 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 we would be remiss to overlook the fact that English became what it is today as a direct product of its colonial history, and that notions of what is considered by many people to be correct, proper, good English, etc., these are notions that are rooted in colonialism, mass exploitation, racism, ableism, sexism, elitism, and so on. And that this has left a mess of language ideologies in places that were directly colonized, but what's interesting is to see how these ideologies and notions of standardness and correctness play out in countries like the Nordic countries, where, as I mentioned before, there is no history of direct kind of colonialism. So I'll leave that kind of conflict with you for now. And I want to move on to the second question, the second main point. And that is Nordic exceptionalism. As I mentioned, I find it fascinating to work within this concept of exceptionalism. I'm going to define it in just a moment on a subsequent slide. But first, I want to lay some ground rules here, lay the foundation, a reminder that even though people in the Nordic countries are known for being really, really proficient in English, English is still nonetheless a mother tongue for a very small portion of the overall population. It varies from country to country, but it tends to be something between 2 and 5%. It's an additional language, something intimate and omnipresent, but still something a little bit other, because it doesn't take the place of the mother tongue for everybody in all domains. A reminder that English got to the Nordic countries as a result of what we call soft or cultural imperialism, rather than the result of colonization or colonialism. And finally, I think this is one of the things that the Nordic countries are really known for today. Everybody speaks English. That's the famous kind of quote, right? Something truly extraordinary has happened. For example, a recent survey from 2021 showed that 95% of the respondents to the survey, who were those in the youngest age bracket, actually claim that English is, quote, easier than their mother tongue. Or 65% claim that expression is easier in English than in their mother tongue. This is something that, as a linguist, just, do we have to distinguish fact from fiction, and what's an ideology versus what's a reality? And I think this might be one of those things that gets overstated, but we can perhaps discuss that a bit later. So here comes a definition of exceptionalism. Exceptionalism, I've defined this based on other definitions in a 2022 paper that I published, as a collective belief that a group or community, for example, a nation state, possesses inherent characteristics that distinguishes it and makes it more special than other groups or nations. And you can see why this might start to go into kind of dangerous territory if you just think you're more special than other people and that makes you right. This can become a very important political question, for example. I don't want to talk about contemporary politics, so I'll just leave it at that. In the Nordic context, anyway, research shows that we tend to have two different kinds of discourses that both relate to exceptionalism, but in different ways. The first way is that we can talk about the, quote, success of the Nordic countries in a number of global measures, including proficiency in English. As I mentioned earlier, the Nordic countries rank way, way up there in terms of overall English proficiency. And let's not, here I am sitting in Finland, which was just voted, or just ranked rather, the happiest country in the world for the 8th time in a row. So these kinds of measures that Nordic people start to think, yeah, we really are special. Look at us. We rank so high in all of these different global rankings. The second sense of exceptionalism is what we might call exception from blame. So the Nordic countries consider themselves to be innocent in a way because they don't consider themselves to be active colonizers in the way that other European powers were, like France, Portugal, Spain, England, and so on. This is an interesting question, which is, well, technically not true, but we're talking about ideologies here. And ideologies are beliefs. They don't have to be rooted in history or fact, do they? So this is a really interesting case here. But more or less what we can think of as exceptionalism in the Nordic countries is these commonly held set of ideals, which indeed do carry over across all the Nordic countries, that we're fair people, we are just people, we do things right. There's also this sense of humility that comes in, which is interesting. But most importantly, based on the social welfare model, we all have an equal chance. We all contribute to make society work. These are some of the overriding ideologies that make the system work. Okay, that's the backdrop. Now let's return to the question of language. And I would like to again show that we have some conflicts which manifest. So, for example, here's an example from about 10 years ago, but I raised this example because I happened to be consulted with. So this is a headline in Finnish. I know you can't read Finnish, but this is what it says. An expert, the expert was me, expert on party leaders' English skills. I did not understand Olive Soini's speeches. What happened here was an occupational hazard that as an English professor, and I happen to be a native speaker of American English, I was consulted by a news agency to listen to presidential candidates from Finland speak English and comment on the way they spoke. A terrible task. But I thought if I don't do it, somebody else will, and they might make it even uglier than I will, so I agreed to do it. And then the headline read that I didn't know how to understand the English of the man you see here, who at the time was the leader of the populist party in Finland, so the far right party. And you can imagine the kind of hate mail I got after this appeared. But my point is that if everything is equal and language is equal, why are we evaluating the way potential Finnish presidents speak English? We don't do that here, I thought, right? We're all equitable when it comes to language and other social manifestations. Here's another example. This is from a few years ago as well. And this particular, she was a former minister of, I forgot the word now, foreign affairs. And the headline says, Katri Kulmuni, that's the woman you see pictured here, her delightful British English dropped jaws on social media. So we consulted experts. This time it wasn't me. I said no. We wanted to know if she would be an upper or a lower class Brit. Now, this headline ran in Finland's major daily newspaper. And again, you can see where I'm going with this. If we don't care about social class, if we don't have this history of class distinctions and colonization and elitism here, why are we asking experts if this woman speaks with an upper class or lower class British accent? Incidentally, she said that she learned English from watching the television series Emmerdale, which is interesting because she was also evaluated as speaking upper class British. Those things don't go together either. So you can see, I hope, my point that the equality that we're supposed to have here in the Nordic countries is not necessarily extended to our views that we have of how English is used. So as I see it, as this proficiency grows and grows and grows in the Nordic countries, and we have this social backdrop, we're all equal, everything is shared, we have a couple of options here. Does our increased proficiency in English also lead to increased tolerance? Or does increased proficiency lead to even higher standards? Always making the carrot a little bit higher expectations and even more exclusion based on who has proper English, who has acceptable English, and who does not. So do we adhere to the system started by the colonial powers, the UK and the US, for example, or do we actually apply our Nordic values of equality and access to our own use of English? Of course, there are many arguments for and against both perspectives. So I've heard them all. You probably have a few to add. Of course, there has to be a standard. Well, the question is, where does the standard come from? When it comes to language teaching, when it comes to editing, to getting published in a journal, there has to be gatekeeping. It's been pointed out that English as a lingua franca actually serves as an equalizer for all the different kinds of language backgrounds within the Nordic countries, that it actually enhances cooperation, levels the playing field, so to speak, and that we need support for our systems within the universities and so on. So again, we can open this up in the question and answer, the pros and cons for these perspectives on the use of English. I'll turn now to my third point, and that is, who owns our English? I think my use of the word our there is quite telling about what I think. But yes, is it us or is it somebody else? I'm going to start here with an overview of the contemporary realities. And I think this is especially interesting for the folks who are joining around the world, because I know that these points do not compare in every setting. So in the Nordic countries right now, I would propose, and other linguists I think would agree, that we must talk about multiple Englishes even within our given nation states. So in other words, we actually have multiple kinds of Finnish Englishes, different kinds of Norwegian Englishes, Danish Englishes, etc., which have to do with things like proficiency and access and what kind of domains of English we're talking about. So for many, many decades now, we've been hearing about this concept of English coming from above, which means the more formal academic standards like what you folks do, or it's more associated with classroom learning of English, or English from below, which is what this guy on the right is doing. He's been a professional gamer. This man's name is Felix Kjellberg. He lives in Gothenburg, Sweden, and he's made millions and millions of euros by playing games on YouTube and speaking English while he does it. So this would be an example of English from below. He does it on his own time. He's learned his particular register of English largely from this gaming environment. So what we mean by English from below, of course, is the personal relationships that people have with English, and largely learned outside the classroom and outside of formal domains. In the book that I mentioned earlier, this English in the Nordic countries, my colleague Christy Beers Fagersten, she's also based in Sweden. She came up with these different terms. We have these different uses that are associated with English. So people code switch a lot into English in the Nordic countries, and there's also quite a lot of borrowings. So lingua emotiva, lingua ludica, lingua maledicta. What she's talking about there is that for some reason, I find this very interesting. Nordic people many people seem to think that it's easier to express emotion in English. So one of my favorite examples that it's a known phenomenon that in Iceland, Finland, Sweden, etc., when parents drop off their children at the daycare, they'll speak Swedish, 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 and then they'll say, love ya, and then they'll leave. So even saying love you to your own children, for some reason, people seem to prefer to do it in English. Christy Beers Fagersten has pointed out that English is often, for example, the punchline to a joke. So it'll be Swedish, 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 and then the joke wraps up by saying something in English. So English, there's this symbolic value that just using the English tagline lends humor to a situation. And then finally, this lingua maledicta, Beers Fagersten, she's a specialist on how people swear. And these days in the Nordic countries, there's lots and lots of use of English swear words and more aggressive language borrowed from English as well. So I think these are really fascinating points. So while in other countries, we might not be at this level at this point, in the Nordic countries, we can see that English has really moved away from being exclusively associated with highly proficient, correct kind of speakers of RP and so on, what we would consider really standard prescriptive forms of English, to really being a mixed resource. It's popular, it's accessible. So we have people who very proudly speak what we call Finglish or Danglish or whatever, and this might tie into the notions of nationalism. And another trend that we have these days is that for some reason, people from the young people, especially from the Nordic countries, it seems to be like there's some kind of pride or esteem from saying, oh, well, I didn't learn English in the classroom. I learned it on my own. Like, I use the example before of the television series Emmerdale. I learned it from Emmerdale. I learned it from watching Donald Duck. I learned it from gaming. It's somehow like there's this shame involved in admitting that you might have actually learned English in a classroom, like has been the traditional case. So yes, the questions I have at this point: who owns English? Who gets to be an expert? Is it the native speakers? If so, what does that actually mean when people in the Nordic countries these days are growing up with English simultaneously with their Finnish, their Swedish, their Danish, the Norwegian? Is it English language scholars, English language teachers, English language professionals? Is it politicians, language boards that get to decide? Well, I can tell you myself that as an English professor, I don't feel very much ownership of English when I'm in my classroom and I'm talking to gamers. They're speaking a totally different English than I am. I learned from them what that version of English is. So yeah, this brings us back to this very famous notion from the philosopher Pierre Bourdieu, who calls this linguistic capital, and how different kinds of language, including different kinds of using English in this case, relate to social capital. Yeah, I think I've got about 10 more minutes to talk, and I'll be wrapping up soon, just so you can know if you want to pay attention or not. I think all of this background leads to some tensions surrounding English in the Nordic countries. One of the main ones being that, do we adhere to the externally prescribed norms of English, by which I mean prescribed from the US and the UK, Or do we go towards local norms of English, which many people seem to think that they prefer, actually, in this day and age? Certain studies in Finland, for example, have shown that, no, we actually like the way Finnish people speak English. We find it easier to understand. And then we have this other set of tensions. I talked before about this feeling of threat that the national languages of the Nordic countries, that there's too much English at this point. So on the one hand, we love English and we're so good at it and we're claiming it and it's ours. But there's this whole wave of discourse. This is especially true in Finland at the moment. No, English is the enemy. It's eating up our national languages. We have to protect Finnish. We have to protect Swedish, and so on. As an example, I'll show you. Here's the research project that I mentioned, this language awareness and ideologies in Finland. We just conducted a survey. The results were just gathered at the end of last year, so in December. The survey was answered by 1,134 people. And as you can see here on the far end, the vast majority of the people who answered the survey said they speak English. 58% say they speak effortlessly. 84% say they know how to read in English. 72% say that they know how to understand spoken English. A further measurement in our survey revealed that 52% of the respondents actually said that English is very important in Finland and in their own lives. Only 2% said that it's not important at all. So we have these we get here a real sense of ownership over English, that it's very well integrated, but the same survey also shows, I know you can't read the Finnish, so I have a synopsis here. 70% of the respondents say they don't like English borrowings. They don't approve of code switching. This survey was conducted in Finland, so 81% of people say that the Finnish language is becoming too much like Finglish, too much mixed, that they want to keep the language pure, whatever that means. And 75% of the respondents claim that the English language is actually impoverishing the Finnish language. So as I mentioned, we have this constant stream of discourse here in Finland at the moment that, here's just one sample. Toddlers babbling in YouTube English confound Helsinki pediatricians. They say this is distressing. And if you read the article, it says, oh, they don't speak any language properly. What are we going to do about this mixed language? So there's real kind of panic. And then again, the domain issue. Is the English language killing Finnish? We get headline after headline like this. So I would actually conceptualize this as being real evidence of the level of proficiency and the fact that when you're really, really good at something, you have the privilege of taking it for granted, right? And this kind of notion was summarized by Professor Andrew Lin in the book English in the Nordic Countries, which I mentioned several times already. The quote is something along the lines of, well, the Nordic countries now have the luxury of eschewing English, pushing it away, making it the bad guy, while at the same time, we continue to reap the benefits of being very good at it. And I think that's very nicely put there. Going to turn now to my final topic, which is who are we publishing for when we publish in English? So earlier, when I talked about how English came to the Nordic countries, I established that, well, a well-known fact, really, that the Nordic countries welcomed English with open arms because they wanted the global connections and the status that comes along with being exceptionally good at English. And this started already in the post-World War II period. There's always two sides, at least, to every story. And what we don't talk about that much is that this was all the spread, here I go again, the spread of English to be a dominant language was actually a very concerted effort, not only by the British government, but also by the US government in the terms of the Peace Corps, for example. So here's a quote that I think is very enlightening. This is from 1935, okay, at the inauguration of the British Council, which famously has sent teachers of English all throughout the world, including to the Nordic countries. Quote, "The basis of our work must be the English language, and we are aiming at something more profound than just a smattering of our tongue. Our object is to assist the largest number possible to appreciate fully the glories of our literature, our contribution to the arts and sciences, and our preeminent contribution to political practice. This can be best achieved by promoting the study of our language abroad." Prince of Wales, later Edward VIII, yes, he was the one who abdicated in the 1935 inauguration of the British Council. It is indeed difficult to interpret this quotation as anything other than nationalist, and the link between politics and language is always there. I was going to say under the surface, but it's not even under the surface. It's right there. So language teaching wasn't just for altruistic purposes, it was also to spread political influence and ideologies. So who benefits from us publishing in English? I'm sure this has come up in previous meetings that you've had with each other as in your profession. There are enormous benefits, political, economic, social, and cultural, in having your language as the world's lingua franca and as the world's language of science. Here are a few quotes from experts in linguistics. "These factors bring, quote, very real economic and political advantages to the promoters of the spread of English. Investing in global English means investing in teachers, teacher trainers, materials, and instructional technology originating primarily from Anglophone center countries, constituting in effect a financial flow from periphery to center, back to the English-speaking countries, the mother tongue settings." Here are some figures. Ireland and the United Kingdom benefited from continental Europe to the tune of 16 to 17 billion pounds per year because of the dominance of English. And a final quotation, again from Ingrid Pillar. "The US economy saves up to US $19 billion per year because they don't need to spend time and effort learning or using other languages." So again, the question, who are we publishing in English for? Back to the center from the periphery? Is it the US, the UK, or is it a supposed global English-speaking audience? I know from looking at my own readership from online platforms like ResearchGate and so on, that much of what we publish actually is on local themes and tends to be consumed by local audiences. So we could just write in Finnish and Swedish or Danish, perhaps, since it's local anyway. So there's this idea that it will be consumed or appreciated by a wider audience, but because the themes tend to be quite local, I'm not so convinced. And there's so much competition globally. And furthermore, remember when I mentioned earlier that Finnish people sometimes actually say they prefer the English of other Finnish speakers. And this is borne out in the research on English as a lingua franca. But it's not surprising that when German people speak English together, they can understand each other better, more easily than somebody who's, say, from, I don't know, France and Finland. Okay, so for example, right now I'm reviewing a volume which was published here in Finland. It's published in English, but I can tell you that it's very, very much an example of what I would consider Finnish English. Therefore, somebody who's more familiar with Finnish will be able to understand this book in English better. So again, the question, who is this for? Can somebody truly from the outside understand it if it's written in a local form of English? If this is indeed the case, Wouldn't it just be easier to publish in the Nordic languages and get back to that problem of not having enough language of science in the national languages? I think there's all kinds of reasons why this doesn't happen in reality, and I'm not that naive, but I just think it's interesting to ponder these questions. So again, I bring this back to exceptionalism and the fact that these collective trends, as discussed collectively in my presentation, point towards new forms of ownership of English in the Nordic countries, which in many ways are removed from the traditional proprietors, by which I mean mainly the US and the UK. Where do we go with this then? Do we go in towards this more inside view, nationalist tendencies, or again, quoting from Andrew Lynn in the final chapter of our book, the Nordic countries have huge experience, and he encourages us not to agonize over this domain loss problem, but rather to contribute openly and generously to non-colonialistically to addressing the practical, social, and economic challenges around English globally. So if we can in fact do this, that would be something that we could consider to be truly exceptional and also groundbreaking. That is the end of my presentation, and I thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop sharing at this point.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for a most interesting and thought-provoking talk. Even incorporating ABBA and PewDiePie, that was impressive.
Yes.
I will say. We already have some questions and comments in the Q&A, so please write your questions or comments in the Q&A, or raise your hand if you want to speak, and then Mary could open up for you. I think we should start with Eva Adonovsky, who has a few comments. Would you like to present those yourself, Eva? Yes, it seems like that.
Yes, can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Okay, thanks. Well, one of the things that we are struggling with is the lack of terminology in our native language, since I'm coming from the field of biotechnical sciences, and in this field, English expressions are commonly used. And since we are publishing in our journal Food Technology and Biotechnology in English, but we are translating abstracts to Croatian, a language that we are struggling to find a proper term because we are lacking terminology, or at least some standard terms for some parts of our field, for example, in genetics and molecular biology most commonly. So this could be quite challenging for us. Is it the same in Nordic countries? Do you struggle with the lack of terminology, or
very
you
much?
are
And here,
developing
yeah,
your
perhaps
own?
others who are here from the Nordic countries could perhaps answer this even better than me. But I will raise an example from Iceland that I'm familiar with, and that is that, Iceland, it's only, 300,000 speakers of Icelandic or something like that. So they're really, really worried about keeping Icelandic alive as a language of science. And so what they've done, just as you mentioned, Eva, that they've really made a concerted effort, the language board there, to come up with Icelandic words. And do you know what happens then? The people who work in the scientific fields, they feel like they're forced to use the sort of made-up Icelandic words, and then they still keep using the English words as borrowings or calques in some cases, even though they're not official. And what tends to happen is that these words then take on different nuances of meaning, so that when they're really forced to use those words, like in an Icelandic publication, it's really, really difficult. I mean, I'm sure the same might be true in other Nordic countries as well, but I just happen to know about that case. So, what a struggle. And then even when they try, it doesn't go well because you can't force people to use these terms, can you?
Yes, that's true. We are sometimes translating, finding translations which are proper translations made by a group of people who is working on it, and then my colleagues ask me, what does it mean? What is this?
Yeah.
Is it some
And how do
like a
we use this?
made up word? I said no, it's our national term for that. So yeah, it's
because it
hard
can
to.
seem so artificial. Yeah,
Yes.
it's really a challenge.
Yeah. Thank
Well,
you. Excellent presentation. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much.
I think, Eva, to answer your question from my perspective as well, we are a medical journal publishing primarily in Norwegian, but translating to English all our scientific articles. And we have the same problem as you do, because there are some words in the medical literature which do not exist in Norwegian. And then comes another problem on top of that, is that as the doctors, we are obliged to be able to communicate with our patients as well. So when we do not have Norwegian words for important medical terms, that is a democratic problem. So our job, I think, as a journal also is to try at least to translate new English medical words to Norwegian because of that. And I think our experience is that if we are early enough when a new word comes in and then translates at once, then we, at least from time to time, we are lucky, and the doctors and the scientists as well, they adopt that Norwegian word. But if we're too late, when the new word has kind of taken hold, then it's hopeless. So that's a challenge indeed. So, but we have more comments. We have one from, Herianto The. Sorry about that pronunciation. Who writes, switching from local language to English seems very common in Nordic countries from your point of view. So children are growing up bilingual. Is that your point? And how about the communication of people there with the visitors or tourists? I also want to know about the support of academic English provided by schools, colleges for students. Thanks. And Ines, you would like to answer this question. You are muted.
Sorry, yes. I mean, if you look at that, I don't think children are necessarily growing up bilingual, right? At least not many of them. And the communication with I'm not quite sure. I mean, the support of academic English provided by schools and colleges for students is definitely high in the Nordic countries. Is that, at least from my perspective, as a non-Swede living in Sweden, I can see this from the people I'm working with, and I guess the same is true in Norway. Or would you not agree, Are and Finland? That's a high level. I would like to take actually the next question, which is quite interesting. Can I read it out? It's an anonymous attendee who raises concerns, and they're quite complex. So there are 3 points here. The first one is, how are these ideas different or far elevated from being merely woke, draped in the sophistication or academic discourse? That's the first question. The second is, as regards the idea that correct English is a tool for colonization, subjugation, and other sorts of epistemic violence, is this, quotation marks, correct? Is being linguistically correct as far as grammaring is concerned in and of itself a tool for violence? Maybe we take the 2 first, and then we come, because the next one is depending a little bit on what your answers to the first 2 questions are. Elizabeth, I think this is for you.
Oh, I was hoping you would take that one, Ines.
I don't think I can.
No. I think point number 1 is, an expected observation. That's what we do in academia, isn't it? We drape things in academic discourse. So check. I've done that. Well spotted. We like to problematize things. That's what we're here for. As regards the idea that correct English is a tool for colonization, subjugation, and other sorts of epistemic violence, is this correct? Is being linguistically correct as far as grammar is concerned in and of itself a tool for violence? I think it's a question of what we want to do with the English, because certainly language, and the English language in particular, has been used as a tool for violence. Many different authors have written about this. I've also written about this in a book called Making Sense of Bad English. There's been, and the books that I cited there from Ingrid Pillar, very good book about the violence of the English language. So we participate in these circles where we're scientists, medical doctors, academics, and so on. We do a certain thing with language. We're playing along here. So I think there we have this expectation of being correct, but you're quite right to point out that within the setting of the Nordic countries, then I'm calling into question, is this something that that really fits with the overall ideologies? If the answer to number 2 is all yes, how is that not self-predicting and self-defeating? We can be many things at the same time. We don't have to choose. There's a time and a place for this kind of English, for this kind of English, and for this kind of English. When it comes to subjugation and human rights and what you call violence here, then that's something to consider within that particular context.
To be honest, I've been thinking a little bit about this sometimes when we do edit heavily, and this is not confined to Nordic or non-Nordic languages, what you do, because language mirrors thinking, right? The way you structure your phrases and the way you build up your argument is linked to the way you think. And if you work in across different cultures, across different countries, arguments, languages are brought forward differently. And when we try to put these into a very strict frame, I also sometimes think we're doing something where we're potentially changing more than just correcting the phrase. And in that sense, there is an element of active interference with the content when you edit, when you change language in another of a non-native speaker, but also of a native speaker.
It's very well known that there are different culturally specific discourse styles, but what tends to get propagated then, of course, is this sort of Anglo-centric discourse style, which is about the red thread, and it starts with, say, so yeah, exactly that.
Yeah, that's an interesting angle, Ines, and I think I'm not the only one who need to write in order to think. So which language I write in, that influences the way I think about things, obviously. So, and that links to another question from our anonymous attendee, who writes, I would understand that publishing is predominantly addressed to topic specialists. Could the development of translation tools, along with digital publishing, provide a method of solving language in publishing?
I was thinking exactly the same thing when I wrote the talk and also when I said it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but on this, but you also mentioned that when you are reviewing this book written by a Finn in what you would call a kind of Finglish,
Finnish colored English, yeah.
Exactly. Then that book or that text would be easier to understand for a Finn who reads English than
for somebody who speaks Finnish.
Croatian,
yeah, that's what.
Or a Norwegian.
Yeah, the whole time I'm reading that, I'm thinking, would people who don't speak Finnish would they understand this text? And I think that's a really fascinating question.
Yes, and I think the translation tools, the LLMs, the large language models, they would not be able to translate such a text, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
You would need to have the human double language problem in order to produce such a text, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, because going back to this discourse styles, I think we have translators for very good reasons.
Exactly.
Mm.
I think we have time for one other question, and we could go to Kjetil Gundersen from the Language Council of Norway, who says, thanks for a very interesting talk. Do you know of any research in the Nordic countries on how unevenly English skills and English use are distributed among young people? My personal experience from Norway is that I often hear young people who are code switching a lot, but I also often hear young people who are not code switching. That has made me wonder about the status of code switching. Is it something that some groups or subcultures engage in a lot, while others do not? And if so, what are the factors that influence the use of code switching? Or is the main trend rather than most young people code switch, but they just don't do it all the time?
Love this question. Yeah, this is a great question. So young people tend to talk like young people depending on the audience. So I think that you answered your own question. They just don't do it all the time. So I don't think we give young people quite enough credit. You know, now they're ruining the language. You'll never hear anybody say, oh, I love the way young people talk. They're making our language so beautiful. No, it's always the opposite. They're ruining it. Why do they use so much English? But they're smarter than we give them credit for. So they'll code switch a lot with each other or in a given setting, but then, you know, their grandparents come around or the teacher comes around, and most of them know to stop that because it's not the right audience anymore. So it's very much a question of audience design, I would say. I think your question also gets at an interesting question that frankly we don't know enough about. So we tend to talk about young people, and they're so proficient and so on. But the fact of the matter is that we don't know how widespread that is. I think that we need to have more studies about proficiency in very rural areas, for example, because I think it differs a lot. But a lot of the research tends to focus on urban areas for obvious reasons, because that's where the universities are. So really interesting question. Thank you.
And then I think the last question goes to Marie Huxtable, who writes, we are all part of a global community with common concerns. How can we work together if we don't develop an academic lingua franca? If English, I do not mean English, American English, etc., is not to be the basis, what other language would serve better? That's an easy one. That would be Norwegian, of course.
Which Norwegian?
So what do you say?
I have to admit that I'm starting to be more and more, this is just a personal opinion based on my own expertise, that we're at the saturation point that we're publishing in English just for the sake of publishing in English. And I think that's one of the points that I tried to raise in my presentation. So I think that it should be English, American English, when indeed we're looking for a global audience. That seems to make sense. But back to my point with this book that I'm reading right now that's sort of Finnish English, if only Finnish people can understand it anyway, what's the point? Just write it in Finnish in the first place. So maybe we need to see the scale coming back towards writing more in the national languages. I would be very happy to see that.
I think that's a very interesting concluding point indeed. We have in Norway now, we've just had a debate about whether you could write your PhD thesis in Norwegian. And our two biggest universities,
oh, radical.
No. They just say, no, you have to write in English. And I think it's a sense of, it's not proper science if it's not written in English.
Yeah.
Which is very strange.
Isn't that
indeed.
interesting?
Yeah.
That's an ideology.
Well,
very interesting.
I think that wraps up our Nordic webinar. Thank you so much, Elizabeth Peterson, for this wonderful presentation. And as you can see, this sparked a lot of debate, both in the Q&A and a lot of thank yous and wonderful presentation and fruitful presentation. Thank you very much. Very interesting and relevant, etc. in the chat. So
I would be happy to read the chat if one of you would be kind enough to download it for me. I think these are some really interesting questions here. If I think Mary could do that, perhaps.
I think we have
Yeah,
to
but
rely
I just
on
want to say that
America
I've
doing
enjoyed talking to you, and thank you again for the invitation.
And thank you so much. And goodbye, everyone. And I hope to see as many as possible of you in Norway in May for the East Conference. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.